Western EcoSystems Technology Incorporated was founded in 1990 by my partner and I, Dr. Lyman McDonald. We specialize in environmental and statistical consulting and contract research. We specialize in dealing with complex issues that require a science-based approach, and we try to produce results that stand up to legal and peer scrutiny. We have 12 offices around the country. Our headquarters is in Cheyenne, Wyoming, because I live there. We have another fairly good-sized office in Laramie because Lyman lives there, and all the other decisions were made for good business purposes. We have a number of clients that we've worked for over the years, from the oil and gas industry to the mining industry to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of Energy, a number of states and municipalities. We have done a lot of work over the last 15 to 18 years with the renewable energy industry, and have worked for EDP Renewables, BP Alternative Energy. Interestingly enough, we also work for NOAA on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill injury assessment. So that I talked with our BP client before we accepted that offer to work for NOAA, and they said they would rather us be working for them than some consultant they didn't know. So I don't know whether that was a vote of confidence or not, but it worked for me. What I want to talk with you today about is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service land-based energy guidelines. I want to give you a brief history, why I think they're important, how they work, and what is adherence. So, and I believe this is a very positive product of collaboration. And I think it will end up helping resolve not all the avian issues, not all the wildlife issues, but a lot of them. It does not resolve the eagle issue, and I won't talk in any detail, in spite of what Mr. Dennis said, about the eagles unless you ask questions. I'll try to answer questions about eagles, but I'm going to deal with the guidelines themselves. The commercial wind energy development began in the late 1990s, and people, particularly in California, began to be concerned about avian fatalities. Altamont was the source of the initial problem. Altamont is unique, but the problem it created for the industry has remained, it does remain to some extent. The service became concerned about this avian issue, primarily because there are laws that they're required to enforce associated with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, Bald and Golden Eagle Act, Endangered Species Act. So they created some interim guidance in 2003. That guidance was created without input from the industry and really without input from NGOs. It was created by, at least first draft, by a couple of guys in Montana to solve a very specific problem, and then it got elevated to a national interim guidance. And after the interim guidance came out, dealing primarily with birds, bat fatalities became an issue. So the interim guidance didn't cover bats. It wasn't a collaborative effort, and so there was a lot of comments about this interim guidance, particularly from industry, but even from NGOs, indicating that people just weren't happy with it. So the Secretary of Interior convened a wind turbine guidelines federal advisory committee, a FAC or a FACA, and I was a technical advisor to that committee, and we worked for several years trying to develop these guidelines, that were at least recommendations for service on these guidelines. The stakeholders included industry, states, tribes, NGOs. We made recommendations, or the committee made recommendations to the Secretary of Interior. The Fish and Wildlife Service then took those regulations and drafted new guidelines. The Federal Advisory Committee objected to that initial draft, and what was unique about this situation, it was not the industry objecting to that initial draft. It was all the members of the Federal Advisory Committee, including NGOs, the state agencies, and industry. So it was a very powerful collaboration of individuals that was successful in moving the Fish and Wildlife Service forward with some guidelines that the industry, I believe, feels like they can live with. The guidelines were published in March of 2012. They're voluntary. A number of the NGOs wanted them to be required, but they're voluntary. And they promote, if followed, they promote effective communication among developers, agencies, and the public. And the service believes that when they're used in concert with other regulatory tools, that they're the best practical approach to developing wind and conserve wildlife. And that's a major step forward for the service to take that position. So who should follow the guidelines? These guidelines are designed primarily for utility scale land-based wind energy projects, so large projects. The service does expect that community scale or small projects will consider the general principles as these projects are developed, and in particular they've encouraged developers to answer the large-scale siting questions. In other words, if you are trying to decide where to site your project, even if it's only 1 or 2 turbines, they ask that you consider the avian issues and the other wildlife issues as you select your site. So why should the industry follow the guidelines? Well, there's the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which essentially says that if you kill a migratory bird, you violated the act, and you're subject to fines and other penalties. And there is no alternative. There's no allowance of take under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. It's simply, if you hit a bird with your car, you've violated the Migratory Treaty Act. If you feed birds at your house and a bird flies into the window, you've violated the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So if you build a wind facility, you pretty much know you're going to kill a bird, a protected bird. And so if you have guidelines, which the service recommends, and you can follow those and effectively build your project, and there are some advantages to that. I'll talk a little bit about that. This is a quote from the guidelines. The service will regard a developer's or operator's adherence to these guidelines, including communication with the service, as appropriate means of identifying and implementing reasonable and effective measures to avoid the take of species protected under NBTA and BGIPA. So what that's saying is that we're supposed to arrest you, but if you follow these guidelines, we probably won't. And that's pretty important, because you can't get a Fish and Wildlife Service law enforcement officer to say, if you violate the law, I won't arrest you, because the law says he's supposed to. But the service has said, if you follow these guidelines, we're going to use enforcement discretion. So the guidelines are a little bit different than what's been done in the past. Not entirely, but it's a different process. It's a tiered risk-based approach. I'll try to explain what that means. First, the tiering. The idea is that in Tier 1, there will be a preliminary evaluation of wildlife resources and landscape issues, and that will take into consideration. That'll be taken into consideration when siting a project on the landscape. Tier 2 is a little bit more intense study, a little bit more expensive, more time-consuming, to make a decision about whether to stick with a particular project or not at a particular location. Tier 3 are boots on the ground, concentrated baseline studies that are necessary to meet permitting requirements, necessary to design the project to minimize impacts. Then construction occurs, and Tier 4 is post-construction fatality and habitat monitoring. One of the things that was added, the the service made some concessions on the guidelines, but industry also made some concessions on the guidelines. These guidelines cover all species of concern, not just federally protected species. And it also has the industry agreeing to look at habitat issues. And the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the EPA doesn't require that. I mean, it doesn't protect habitat, but the industry has agreed to look at these habitat issues in Tier 4, and Tier 5 going to be other studies. It's supposed to be risk-based. Before the guidelines were produced, there were a common set of studies that were recommended by the federal agencies and state agencies and the consulting firms that, like our company, that did the work for industry. We kind of knew what the agencies were going to expect, so we would recommend a standard suite of studies. The risk-based approach says that you do a little bit, and if you figure out enough, if you learn enough to make good decisions, and you make good decisions, move on to life. If you do some work, like in Tier 1, you still have a lot of unanswered questions, then if you decide to go on to Tier 2, expect to do more work to answer those questions. So it's a risk-based approach in that you only collect the information needed to answer those questions about risk. You don't have to do all the studies at every location. The study plans are tailored specifically to each site, and the complexity of the studies really will depend on how significant the impacts might be to the resources that are being studied. And it includes all phases of development. So the appropriate, if you read the guidelines, which I wouldn't suggest you do, but if you did, there is constant reference to communications with the service. One of the things that the service really wanted out of this was an agreement from the industry to talk with them, to talk with them early and often. And so the developers' adherence to these guidelines are essentially documenting that they've followed the process and that they're implementing methods of reducing potential impacts, such as siting decisions, technology, that sort of thing, and communications with the service. So communications is repeated a number of times, and the service expects you to document the studies that are conducted and the efforts at communication. And an example they give in the guidelines as documentation is a bird and bat conservation strategy. So in effect, the bird and bat conservation strategy follows the tiered process, documents all the conversations, documents the studies, documents how the decisions were made. And finally, the service expects to see some implementation of effective measures to reduce risk to wildlife. Now, in summary, these studies are based, as I said, on risk, and they're not a standard suite of studies. So theoretically, the studies required to permit and cite a lot of projects will not be as extensive as they were prior to the guidelines. It includes all species of concern, so even though the sage-grouse, for example, or the lesser prairie chicken are not federally listed, so they're not federally protected currently, they are covered in the guidelines. And another example would be non-listed bats are covered in the guidelines. So the guidelines include species of concern that are not federal species. They also increase the level of effort on habitat impacts, particularly for species of, the guidelines call them species of habitat fragmentation concern. So that's code for prairie grouse primarily. Now there will be other species that people want to be covered under species of habitat fragmentation concern, but it's mainly in the guidelines to cover prairie grouse. The definitions such as significance, adherence, species of concern. Those are all going to be negotiated with the Fish and Wildlife Service, particularly early on in the implementation of the guidelines. So it's hard to say exactly what species, for example, will be considered species of habitat fragmentation concern. The other thing that will be negotiated are the protocols, and the protocols are very important in terms of the cost of doing the studies. So things like how many years of pre-construction data will you need, how many years of post-construction fatality monitoring. Those are all really important to the industry because it makes a difference in whether the project is cost effective or not. Finally, the documentation of communications is key to convincing the service that you've actually followed the guidelines, because they are voluntary, but if you want the service to agree that you've actually followed them, you have to document them. You can't just say that you did.